Welcome you. Today on the deep dive, we're really going to try and cut through some of the noise around fat burning.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
Absolutely. And you brought us some really interesting material featuring Professor Ben Bikman, the biomedical scientist, and also Dr. Mark Hyman.
That's right.
So that's going to be our roadmap today. We'll dig into drugs, surgeries, and maybe most importantly, those lifestyle changes.
Especially nutrition, yeah.
Right. We want to pull out the key science-backed stuff for you, the effective strategies for fat loss, improving metabolic health, but hopefully without making it too overwhelming.
Exactly. And the sources you share, like there's a recent metabolic classroom video from Dr. Bikman, and this great conversation he had with Dr. Hyman. They offer, well, really valuable sort of complementary views, all grounded in science.
Good.
And you were keen, you mentioned, on understanding what really works, what's validated, not just for losing fat, but for, fundamentally getting metabolically healthier.
That's the goal.
So that's what we're diving into for you. Should we kick things off with the drugs? The GLP-1 agonists, they're certainly getting a lot of airtime.
Okay, yeah, let's get into it. You've probably heard of these medications, the ones ending in zirglitide.
Semaglutide, liraglutide.
Exactly. And the brand names are everywhere. Wegovy, Ozempic. Dr. Bikman points out they were first used, right, for diabetes at lower doses, affecting glucagon.
Yeah, that's their origin.
But the weight loss effect at these higher doses everyone's talking about seems to come down to something else. It's about dramatically slowing down how fast food moves through your system.
It's actually pretty fascinating, the extent of it. I mean, normally food might be in your stomach for, 3, maybe 4 hours?
Sounds about right.
But with these GLP-1 drugs, Dr. Bikman says that can stretch out to, 24 hours, maybe even longer in some cases.
Wow, a full day.
Yeah, and, it stands to reason, right? If food is just sitting in your stomach for that long,
your desire to eat is going to plummet.
Exactly. It's a very powerful way they kill your appetite. Makes sense.
Now, here's something that was really interesting, maybe a bit unexpected.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Bikman brought up a side effect you don't hear about quite as much.
Okay.
The potential for sexual dysfunction, or just like a loss of libido.
Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah, he sort of suggests that when those signals for desire are being turned down, maybe it's not just about food.
Right. That does make you wonder, doesn't it? Like, what other drives might be getting sort of dampened down by these mechanisms?
Exactly.
But, okay, beyond that, there's something else really critical to understand about the weight you lose. While these drugs definitely make the number on the scale go down, Dr. Bikman really emphasizes that up to 40% of that lost weight, it could be lean mass, muscle.
40%, that's huge.
It is. Think about it. You're losing the very engine of your metabolism. Muscle is so vital.
So while they work fast for weight loss, you might be sacrificing something really important long term.
Precisely. Preserving that muscle tissue should be a key goal.
And that long-term view seems really crucial here, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because Dr. Bikman also stressed how likely it is you'll regain the fat if you stop the drug.
Right. That rebound effect is well documented.
But what's maybe even more worrying is how hard it is to get that muscle back, especially as we age.
Yeah, he was quite blunt about that. He said, for someone past middle age, trying to rebuild that lost lean mass, it can be really, really tough, maybe even impossible for some.
So, okay, effective for weight loss, yes, but definitely some pretty significant things to weigh up there.
For sure.
Right. Let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk surgical interventions. This might be less, top of mind for some listeners, but the sources had some really important insights here, too.
Absolutely. And even if surgery isn't something you'd consider, understanding how these procedures work and their consequences, it actually sheds a lot of light on the core principles of fat loss and metabolism.
Good point.
So Dr. Bikman outlines basically 4 main types of bariatric surgery, sometimes called metabolic surgeries.
Okay. The first one, maybe the most familiar, is the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass.
Right.
So how does this one actually work, mechanically speaking?
Well, essentially, the surgeons cut away a large part of your stomach. They leave just a small pouch at the top.
Okay, tiny stomach.
Yeah, very small. And then they reroute your small intestine. They basically bypass the rest of the stomach that was left. And crucially, they also bypass the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum.
And the duodenum is important because
that's where a lot of the initial digestion really kicks off, as Dr. Bikman pointed out. It's where your pancreatic enzymes and bile acids get introduced to break down food.
Got it. So bypassing it has big consequences.
Huge. It works in a couple of ways. One, the tiny stomach pouch physically stops you from eating much.
Just can't fit it in.
Right. And two, by bypassing the duodenum and some of the intestine, you're deliberately compromising digestion and absorption.
Hmm.
Dr. Bikman actually described it as creating a kind of forced fast.
A forced fast. That's a good way to put it. But it sounds like it comes with some major trade-offs.
Oh, definitely. Dr. Bikman was really clear. You absolutely need lifelong nutritional supplements. Things like vitamin B12 injections. Otherwise, you risk serious deficiencies.
Wow, lifelong.
Lifelong. And even though people lose a lot of weight initially, regain is possible, that little stomach pouch. It can slowly stretch over time.
If eating habits don't fundamentally change, I suppose?
Exactly. Plus, messing with the digestive tract like that, it can lead to ongoing issues, like chronic diarrhea, for example.
Okay, so quite invasive, significant consequences. What's the next type?
The second one is laparoscopic adjustable gastric banding. This one's less invasive because they aren't cutting the intestines.
Okay, so how does the band work?
They place an adjustable band around the very top part of the stomach. This creates a small pouch above the band.
Ah, so it's like pinching the top of the stomach to make it smaller up there.
Pretty much. And Dr. Bikman explained it forces a controlled appetite. Because if you eat too much, the food pushes against the band and it feels uncomfortable.
Right, a physical deterrent to overeating.
Exactly. And because they're not cutting the intestines, you generally have fewer immediate surgical complications compared to the bypass.
But is it as effective for weight loss?
Generally, no. Dr. Bikman noted it tends to be less effective overall than the bypass.
Okay. And number 3?
The third surgery is the laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy, or just sleeve gastrectomy.
The sleeve, right. What happens here?
In this one, they actually remove a large portion of the stomach itself, maybe 80%. What's left is a narrow, tube-like sleeve.
So they're not rerouting intestines, just making the stomach much smaller and tube-shaped. Dr. Bikman called it like a banana shape.
Yeah, that was his analogy. So again, it dramatically cuts down how much food you can eat at one time.
It makes sense.
But also, because the stomach's ability to kind of churn and hold food is reduced, food tends to pass through more quickly.
Leading to
compromised digestion, yeah. And a higher chance of diarrhea. It's still major stomach surgery, so risks like infection or leaks from the staple line are still there, even if it's maybe less complex than the full bypass.
Okay. So still significant. Then the last one.
The last one he mentioned is the biliopancreatic diversion with duodenal switch, or BPDDS.
That sounds complicated.
It is. Dr. Bikman described it as kind of a hybrid procedure. It combines the sleeve gastrectomy, so you get the smaller stomach tube,
Right.
with a major bypass of the small intestine.
Yeah.
Much more than the Roux-en-Y. They bypass most of it, including the duodenum.
Wow. So you get the small stomach and drastically reduced absorption.
Exactly. You eat less, food passes through incredibly quickly, and digestion and absorption are severely compromised.
Sounds like the most extreme one.
It generally leads to the most weight loss, but also has the highest risk of complications like, again, chronic diarrhea and serious nutritional deficiencies. It's a very significant alteration.
So the big picture takeaway on all these bariatric surgeries.
Dr. Bikman's point was clear. They usually cause substantial weight loss up front, no question.
Right.
But weight regain is definitely possible, even likely if you don't make significant sustained lifestyle changes alongside the surgery. The surgery forces a change, but it doesn't guarantee long-term success on its own.
Right. It's a tool, not a magic bullet. Okay. Now let's talk about another procedure, one that's quite different. Liposuction.
Ah, yes, lipo.
This comes up a lot, often more in the context of like body shaping or cosmetics. But Dr. Bikman brought a really important metabolic angle to it. Just so we're clear, liposuction is removing subcutaneous fat, right? The fat just under the skin.
That's right. They physically suction it out.
But here's what was fascinating. Dr. Bikman emphasized that the real metabolic problem with excess fat often isn't just the total amount, but the size of the individual fat cells.
Right. He talked about hypertrophy versus hyperplasia.
Yeah.
Hypertrophy is when existing fat cells get bigger. Hyperplasia is making more fat cells.
And most adult weight gain is hypertrophy. The cells getting bigger.
Generally, yes. That's the main driver.
Okay, so liposuction removes cells. But what about the size issue?
Well, first, remember the type of fat. Dr. Bikman made that crucial distinction between subcutaneous fat under the skin, often smaller cells, maybe more metabolically sound, and visceral fat. That's the deeper stuff around your organs in your abdomen. That's the fat more strongly linked to metabolic problems like insulin resistance.
And liposuction mainly gets the subcutaneous kind.
Exactly. Doesn't touch that deeper visceral fat.
Ah, okay. So it's missing the more problematic fat, metabolically speaking.
Right. And here's the kick of the rebound effect he talked about.
What's that?
Your body kind of has a set point, or at least it's used to storing a certain amount of energy based on your diet and habits.
Right.
If you suddenly remove a bunch of these subcutaneous fat cells with lipo, the body still wants to store that energy somewhere. So the remaining fat cells, they're forced to enlarge, they undergo hypertrophy, to store the energy that the removed cells would have handled.
Oh, wow. So you remove some fat cells, but the ones left behind just get bigger and potentially more stressed.
Exactly. You haven't fixed the underlying reason why the body was storing so much fat in the first place. The metabolic signaling, the insulin levels, the diet.
So what does that mean for health outcomes?
Dr. Bikman pointed out this is why liposuction typically doesn't improve things like blood pressure, blood sugar, or cholesterol. No real cardiometabolic benefit. In fact, it could potentially even worsen insulin resistance in those remaining, now overstuffed fat cells.
So his conclusion was basically
primarily cosmetic. It's not a strategy for improving metabolic health.
Got it. Okay, so drugs and surgeries, they offer ways to kind of force weight loss through different mechanisms. But now let's get to what Dr. Bikman called the elephant in the room.
Lifestyle changes.
Yep, focusing on exercise and, crucially, nutrition.
This is really where the sustainable long-term power lies, isn't it? For both fat loss and metabolic health.
Seems that way. Let's start with exercise. Dr. Bikman had a pretty direct mantra here.
He did. You exercise to be healthy or strong, and you eat smart to be lean.
I thought that was such a clear and frankly important distinction. Yeah. He really emphasized that exercise by itself, generally not that effective for weight loss.
Yeah, he even mentioned that bodies like the American College of Sports Medicine sort of reluctantly agree that exercise alone doesn't really move the needle much on the scale.
Interesting. Why is that? I mean, you burn calories exercising.
You do, but it's often less than people think, and the body can compensate in other ways, like increasing appetite or decreasing other activity. It's complex.
Is there any specific benefit for fat loss from exercise then?
Well, he did mention a potential slight advantage for losing visceral fat, that deeper belly fat.
Oh, yeah. Why?
Possibly because visceral fat seems to be more sensitive to epinephrine, adrenaline, a stress hormone released during exercise that can trigger fat breakdown.
So exercise might target that specific type of fat a bit more directly?
Potentially, yeah. A slight edge there, perhaps. But overall, Dr. Bikman really hammered home the point. If your main goal is shrinking fat cells, the primary focus has got to be nutrition.
Okay, nutrition, the big one. And Dr. Bikman flagged a really common mistake people make right at the start.
Which is?
Just cutting calories, starting with calorie restriction.
Ah, yes. The eat less, move more mantra that often fails.
Exactly. He explained this concept called relative energy deficiency.
Okay, what does that mean?
If you slash your calories, but your insulin levels are still high, which they often are if you're eating the standard modern diet.
Right. Lots of processed carbs, sugar.
Then your body actually experiences a shortage of energy that's readily available in the bloodstream, even if you have plenty of stored fat.
So the energy is locked away in fat cells because of the high insulin.
Kind of. He used an analogy like trying to run a car when the fuel line is clamped shut, even with a full tank. High insulin is the clamp.
Got it. So what happens then?
Well, your brain needs a constant supply of energy, primarily glucose from the blood. It doesn't have big energy stores itself. When the brain senses this low energy availability in the blood because insulin is keeping it locked up, or you've cut calories too drastically without addressing insulin, it panics.
And triggers hunger.
Exactly. Powerful hunger signals. And as Dr. Bikman pointed out, that's why just restricting calories usually doesn't work long term. Hunger almost always wins against willpower alone.
Okay, so if just cutting calories first isn't the answer, what is the crucial first step, according to Dr. Bikman?
Lowering insulin. That's step one.
Get the insulin down first.
Yes. He argues that creates a completely different, much more metabolically advantageous environment in the body.
How so? What happens when insulin comes down?
Several really key things. First, your metabolic rate can actually increase, not decrease, like with calorie restriction.
Right. He mentioned studies showing it can go up by as much as 300 calories a day in some cases when you switch to a low insulin state.
Wow. Okay. What else?
You start producing ketones.
Ah, the byproduct of fat burning.
Exactly. When insulin is low, your body readily switches to burning fat for fuel, and ketones are the result. Think of it like a hybrid car automatically switching to its electric motor when gasoline use is low. Low insulin flips the switch to fat burning.
And ketones themselves, They have calories, right?
They do. And here's a fascinating point he made. When you're making ketones, you actually start breathing some out and excreting some in your urine.
So you're literally losing calories just by being in ketosis.
In a way, yes, a small amount, but it adds up. But maybe the most important effect of lowering insulin is that it allows more energy to be available in the bloodstream, both glucose and ketones. And when your brain senses this abundant energy supply,
it doesn't feel the need to send out those hunger signals.
Precisely. It signals satiety. You naturally feel less hungry. Dr. Bikman cited research showing people on low-carb or ketogenic diets often spontaneously reduce their calorie intake without consciously trying to restrict. Their appetite is just naturally controlled.
That makes so much sense. Control the hormones first, and the appetite follows.
That's the idea.
So how do we actually lower insulin? What are the practical steps?
Dr. Bikman laid out 3 key nutritional principles. Number 1, control carbohydrates.
Okay. What does that mean specifically? Avoid all carbs.
No, not necessarily all. He was particularly critical of processed carbs. The stuff in bags, boxes, things with barcodes. Sugary drinks are a big one too.
So focus on
whole food sources, fruits and vegetables. And he made a point of saying, eat them, don't drink them as juice, which concentrates the sugar and removes the fiber.
Got it. Control carbs, especially processed ones. What's number 2?
Prioritize protein.
Why protein? Right?
Protein has very little impact on insulin. Plus, it's great for satiety, helps you feel full, and it helps maintain muscle mass and your metabolic rate.
Okay, so control carbs, prioritize protein, and number 3.
Don't fear fat.
This one still trips some people up, doesn't it?
It does. But Dr. Bikman emphasized that healthy fats, especially the kind that naturally come with protein and whole foods, think meat, eggs, fish, avocados, olives, they have basically no impact on insulin levels.
So carbs drive insulin up, protein has little effect, fat has little effect.
That's the basic hierarchy, yes. Manage the carbs, get enough protein, and let fat come along naturally with those whole foods.
Okay. Now, he did mention a potential second step, right, after getting insulin down with macros.
Yeah, he talked about calorie control, but framed it more as frequently fasting.
So things like intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He suggested that if you need further fat loss after getting your carbs, protein, and fat sorted, then incorporating structured periods of not eating can be effective.
But he had a caveat there too, didn't he?
Yes, a really important one. He stressed that how you break a fast is actually more important than how long you fast.
Meaning
you need to break it in a way that doesn't lead to a massive binge or undo the benefits. Break it with protein and fat, for instance, not a huge load of carbs.
Right. Avoid that rebound overeating. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Did he mention anything else, sort of complementary strategies?
Briefly, yeah. He called them extras. Things like temperature changes using a sauna or cold plunges.
Oh, yeah. How do they help?
Both can temporarily increase your metabolic rate. Cold exposure makes you shiver, which is muscle activity burning calories, and it can also activate brown fat, that speckled type of fat that burns energy to generate heat.
And sauna.
Sweating itself requires energy, maybe about 1 calorie for every 10 drops of sweat, he estimated. Plus, the heat can increase your heart rate, giving you a slight cardiovascular effect.
Interesting. But these are extras, right? Not the main drivers.
Definitely secondary.
Yeah.
He was clear that diet managing insulin is the primary lever for fat loss. These are just potential small boosts.
Okay. So managing insulin through diet is key. To really understand why this is so central, we need to dig into the root cause that both Dr. Bikman and Dr. Hyman focused on in their conversation.
Yes, insulin resistance.
Dr. Hyman kicked off that part with a statistic that honestly just blew me away.
Which one was that?
He said 88% of adults in the U.S. are metabolically unfit. 88%.
It's staggering, isn't it? And largely driven by insulin resistance.
Yeah. Think about that. Only 12% of U.S. adults are in good metabolic health.
It really puts the scale of the problem into perspective.
And Dr. Bikman reinforced that insulin resistance isn't just about weight or diabetes. It's like the root system for so many chronic diseases.
Mm-hmm. He listed things like cancer, dementia, Alzheimer's, depression, infertility, heart disease.
It's like the common soil they all grow from. Dr. Hyman used a great analogy. He said treating these diseases individually without addressing insulin resistance is like just pruning the branches of a sick tree.
When the real problem is down at the roots. Yeah, that's powerful.
So why is it missed so often in medicine if it's so fundamental?
Well, Dr. Hyman suggested it's partly because medicine has become very glucose-centric. Blood sugar is easy to measure. It's what we test for diabetes.
Right.
But insulin levels often start to rise years, even decades, before blood sugar goes out of whack. Testing insulin just isn't as routine.
So you can look normal on standard blood sugar tests, but actually be severely insulin resistant already.
Absolutely. Dr. Hyman shared a story about a patient, normal glucose, normal A1C, but her fasting insulin was sky high. She was way down the path of metabolic dysfunction, but standard tests missed it.
Wow. Okay, so what is insulin resistance fundamentally? Dr. Bikman had a definition.
Yeah, he called it a coin with two sides.
Okay.
On one side, you have problems at the cellular level. Insulin just isn't signaling properly. The cells aren't responding to it as well as they should.
The cells are becoming resistant.
Yeah, exactly. And the other side of the coin is hyperinsulinemia, meaning your body is pumping out chronically high levels of insulin to try and compensate for that resistance.
Ah, so it's both the cells not listening properly and the body shouting louder and louder with more insulin.
Right, and it becomes a vicious cycle. The high insulin itself can make the cells even more resistant over time.
Okay. And what does this high insulin, this resistance, actually do in different parts of the body?
Dr. Bikman gave some examples,
Right.
like the liver. Normally, insulin tells the liver to stop making glucose and store it instead. But when the liver becomes insulin resistant,
It ignores the signal,
yep, it keeps pumping out glucose even when blood sugar is already high.
contributing to high blood sugar. Okay. What about elsewhere?
In women's ovaries, he explained, high insulin can mess with hormone balance. It inhibits an enzyme called aromatase.
Aromatase. What does that do?
It normally converts androgens, like testosterone, into estrogens. So if high insulin blocks aromatase,
You end up with higher testosterone levels in women.
potentially yes, contributing to symptoms you see in things like PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome.
Interesting. And in men, is it different?
Kind of the opposite can happen sometimes. He mentioned that in men, particularly in expanded subcutaneous fat cells, high insulin can actually increase aromatase activity.
So converting their testosterone into estrogen.
Exactly, leading to lower testosterone and higher estrogen levels. And visceral fat, that deep belly fat, just tends to get better at storing more fat when insulin is chronically high.
It's amazing how one hormone being out of balance has such widespread effects.
It really is. Dr. Bickin used that boy who cried wolf analogy for the cells, right? They just get desensitized from the constant insulin shouting.
Yeah. He also talked about the brain, didn't he? Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes.
Right. The idea there is that brain cells can become insulin resistant too. They struggle to take up and use glucose effectively, even if there's plenty around. It's called glucose hypometabolism.
So the brain is starving for energy, even in a sea of glucose.
In a sense, yes. And because high insulin also suppresses the production of ketones.
The brain's alternative fuel source is also cut off.
Exactly. So it's a double whammy for brain energy.
And it affects blood vessels too. Atherosclerosis.
Yeah. Insulin resistance plays a big role in the inflammation and dysfunction that leads to plaque buildup in arteries. It affects LDL cholesterol particle size and oxidation. It's complex, but definitely involved.
Okay. Then they got into something called mTOR.
Mechanistic target of rapamycin. It's a protein involved in cell growth and proliferation, often talked about in longevity circles.
Right. And how does insulin relate to mTOR?
Insulin is a potent activator of mTOR. And critically, Dr. Bikman pointed out, insulin keeps mTOR switched on for much longer than, say, amino acids from protein do.
Okay, so protein gives a short signal to build muscle, but insulin gives a long signal.
A much longer, more sustained signal. And if insulin is chronically high, mTOR is chronically activated.
And that's bad. Why?
Well, constant activation of growth pathways is thought to potentially accelerate aging processes. The idea is you want cycles of growth and cleanup, autophagy, not constant growth signaling.
So the takeaway isn't necessarily to fear protein's effect on mTOR.
No, because that effect is transient and necessary for muscle building. The real issue is the chronic mTOR activation from constantly elevated insulin driven primarily by diet.
Control the insulin, and the mTOR signal takes care of itself, basically.
That seems to be the argument, yes. Focus on the diet quality.
Which brings us back to diet. They really emphasized getting carbs from whole foods, right? Fruits, vegetables.
Yeah, avoid the processed stuff, bags, boxes, barcodes, as they put it.
And they tackled the big controversial topic, saturated fat.
Always a hot one.
Dr. Bikman explained something really interesting. He said, okay, in a lab dish, yes, certain saturated fats like palmitic acid can directly cause insulin resistance in cells. something about ceramides accumulating.
Right, the direct cellular mechanism.
But, he argued, the majority of the saturated fat that's actually circulating in our blood, it doesn't come directly from the saturated fat we eat.
Where does it come from then?
It's mostly produced by our own liver through a process called de novo lipogenesis, basically, making new fat. And what drives the liver to do that?
High insulin levels, particularly from consuming excess carbohydrates and sugars. The liver converts those excess carbs into saturated fat, like palmitic acid, and releases it into the blood.
Wait a minute. So eating too many refined carbs makes your liver produce the very saturated fat that might cause problems.
That's the argument. It's the high insulin driven by the carbs that's the primary driver of high circulating saturated fats for many people, not necessarily the saturated fat they ate directly.
That's a huge paradigm shift for how most people think about saturated fat.
It is. He also mentioned the body's pretty good at converting dietary saturated fat into monounsaturated fat, like oleic acid, the kind in olive oil, which is generally seen as healthy.
Fascinating. So the focus comes back to controlling the carbs and insulin.
Seems to be the central theme.
Yeah.
They also touched on the issue with omega-6 fats from refined seed oils, like soybean oil, corn oil, etc.
What was the concern there?
Dr. Bikman mentioned that excessive amounts of linoleic acid, the main omega-6 in these oils, can accumulate in our fat cells. It can then get metabolized into compounds like 4-HNE, which might promote inflammation and fat cell hypertrophy, making fat cells bigger and perhaps more dysfunctional.
Okay. And something about oxidation.
Yeah, polyunsaturated fats, like omega-6s and omega-3s, are less stable than saturated or monounsaturated fats. They're more prone to oxidation or damage.
And why is that bad?
Oxidized LDL cholesterol particles are thought to be a key player in initiating the process of atherosclerosis plaque buildup. So the argument is that having LDL particles rich in unstable polyunsaturated fats might make them more likely to become oxidized and cause problems compared to LDL-rich and stable saturated fats.
So more potential harm from easily oxidized seed oils than stable saturated fats in that context.
That's one line of reasoning some experts propose, focusing on the inflammatory nature of heart disease. It's complex, and Dr. Bikman acknowledged human studies are nuanced, but the mechanistic concerns about high intakes of refined seed oils are there.
So the advice is generally to focus on whole food fats, like animal fats, avocado, olive oil, coconut oil, nuts and seeds in their whole form.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Facts from less processed sources.
Okay, this is all making sense. Insulin resistance is the root. Diet is key to managing insulin. So what are the practical steps someone can take if they suspect they have insulin resistance or just want to improve their metabolic health?
Dr. Hyman laid out some clear steps, which Dr. Bikman seemed to agree with. First step, diagnosis. Get tested properly.
Beyond just standard blood sugar.
Definitely. He recommended getting a fasting insulin level test, aiming for under 5 or 6, ideally.
Okay, what else?
A glucose tolerance test, but one that also measures insulin levels at each time point, not just glucose.
So you see how much insulin your body needs to pump out to handle the sugar load.
Exactly. Also, look closely at your lipid panel, specifically the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Aim for that ratio to be below 1.5, maybe even closer to 1.
Triglycerides divided by HDL. Got it.
And maybe more advanced lipid tests like an NMR or cardio IQ, which look at the number and size of lipoprotein particles, not just the cholesterol content.
Any physical signs.
Yeah, waist to hip ratio or waist to height ratio can be good indicators. A waist circumference over half your height is a warning sign. Also, things like skin tags or acanthosis nigricans, those dark, velvety patches of skin, often on the neck or armpits.
Okay, so several ways to assess it. Then what about treatment? Reversing it?
It's really a multi-pronged approach, as Dr. Hyman described, and diet is absolutely number one.
Back to the food?
Yep. Prioritize whole, unprocessed foods. Dramatically reduce or eliminate refined carbs and added sugars. Focus on getting adequate, high-quality protein. Include those healthy fats from whole food sources we talked about.
That may be timing.
Yeah, considering time-restricted eating or some form of intermittent fasting can be really beneficial for improving insulin sensitivity.
What about other lifestyle factors?
Exercise is definitely important. Any activity helps, especially moving after meals. A mix of cardio and strength training is ideal.
Strength training for the muscle mass.
Crucial. And stress reduction is key, too. Finding ways to manage stress, meditation, mindfulness, yoga, whatever works for you.
Yeah.
Chronic stress raises cortisol, which can worsen insulin resistance.
Right. Any role for supplements.
Dr. Hyman mentioned several that might offer support. Always best discussed with a doctor, of course. Things like berberine, cinnamon, vitamin D, alpha-lipoic acid, magnesium, omega-3 fats. They may help improve insulin sensitivity for some people.
And medications, like metformin.
Metformin is often prescribed. It's an insulin sensitizer. But Dr. Hyman emphasized, and studies often show, that lifestyle changes, particularly diet, can be even more effective than metformin for preventing or reversing diabetes and insulin resistance.
Lifestyle first, always.
That's the message.
Okay, so wrapping this all up for you listening, it really seems like insulin resistance is this huge central piece of the puzzle for metabolic health and for sustainable fat loss.
Absolutely. And the most effective strategy long-term isn't about these forced methods like some drugs or surgeries might represent, but really about prioritizing managing your insulin levels.
Primarily through dietary changes, right? Controlling those refined carbs and sugars seems paramount.
And adopting that whole healthy lifestyle approach. The right food, movement, stress management, sleep.
And remember that point about fat cells. The goal isn't just to remove them, like with liposuction.
Right, it's to shrink the ones you have by creating a healthier metabolic environment where they aren't constantly being overloaded due to high insulin.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to maybe chew on. Given everything we've heard about how profoundly insulin impacts almost every aspect of health, what's one small but significant change you could maybe try implementing in your own daily routine starting today to begin prioritizing managing it?
It doesn't have to be a massive overhaul overnight. Maybe it's swapping out one sugary drink, or adding a walk after dinner, or focusing on protein at breakfast.
Something small to start shifting that balance. We definitely encourage you to explore what personalized strategies might work best for you, and always, always consult with knowledgeable healthcare professionals on your journey.